The rain hammered against the rusted metal roof of the old warehouse on the outskirts of Newark, New Jersey. It was the kind of rain that seemed to wash away everything. The dirt from the streets, the noise from the city, even the memories people tried to forget. But inside that warehouse, nothing was being washed away. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, tension, and the weight of decades of secrets. Around a long wooden table sat 6 men. They were not ordinary men. They were members of the DeLuca family, one of the most feared organized crime syndicates on the East Coast. Their suits were expensive, their watches gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights, and their eyes carried the cold calculation of men who had survived in a world where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Don Enrico DeLuca sat at the head of the table. He was in his late 60s, his hair silver and slicked back, his face lined with the scars of a life lived in the shadows. His hands, strong and weathered, rested on the table, one of them adorned with a gold ring bearing the family crest. He had built this empire from nothing, clawing his way up through loyalty, cunning, and an iron will. Tonight, they were discussing territory disputes, profit margins, and the loyalty of certain associates who had begun to whisper dissent. But the conversation was interrupted. The heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse suddenly burst open with a violent crash. The sound echoed through the cavernous space like a gunshot. Every man at the table went silent. Hands instinctively moved toward concealed weapons. Eyes narrowed, hearts pounded. And then she appeared. A young woman stepped through the doorway, soaked to the bone from the rain. Her dark hair clung to her face, water dripping from the strands onto the concrete floor. Her clothes, a worn jacket, jeans, and boots, were muddy and disheveled. But it was her eyes that caught their attention. They burned with something raw and desperate. Fear, yes, but also fury. In her trembling hands she held a gun. The men at the table didn't move. Some of them were already calculating how to disarm her. Others were deciding whether she was a threat or just a foolish girl who had walked into the wrong place at the wrong time. But Don Enrico simply stared at her. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked like recognition. The young woman's voice cracked as she spoke, but her words were clear and deliberate. She demanded to know who her father was. She didn't plead, she didn't beg. She asked with the weight of someone who had spent years searching for an answer that had been kept from her. The warehouse fell into a suffocating silence. The only sounds were the rain outside and the faint hum of the lights above. The men exchanged glances, some confused, others wary. But Don Enrico's gaze never left the girl. He knew exactly who she was. Clara Rossi had spent her entire life in the shadows of other people's stories. She grew up in a small apartment in Brooklyn with her mother, Maria Rossi, a woman who cleaned offices at night and worked double shifts at a diner during the day. Maria never spoke about Clara's father. Whenever Clara asked, her mother would grow silent, her eyes distant, as if looking at something too painful to name. Clara's childhood was marked by absence, not just the absence of a father, but the absence of answers. She watched other kids with their families, saw fathers at school events, heard stories about Sunday dinners and baseball games. She had none of that. What she had was her mother's tired smile and the quiet, unspoken rule that some questions were never to be asked. But as Clara grew older, the questions became louder. In her teenage years, she began to notice things. The way her mother would tense up whenever certain names were mentioned on the news. The way she would quickly change the channel if a story about organized crime came on. The way she kept a small, faded photograph hidden in a drawer. A photograph of a man Clara had never met, wearing a suit and a gold ring. When Clara was 19, her mother fell ill. Cancer, the doctors said. It spread quickly. In the final weeks of her life, Maria's walls began to crumble. One evening, Sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, Clara finally asked the question she'd been holding in for years. She asked who her father was. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She reached out with a frail hand and touched Clara's cheek. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she told her daughter the truth. She said that Clara's father was a man from a world Maria had tried to escape, a man of power, of danger, of violence. A man who wore a gold ring with a family crest. She said his name only once before her strength gave out. DeLuca. A week later, Maria Rossi died. Clara was left alone, clutching that faded photograph and a name that carried weight she didn't fully understand. But she understood enough. She understood that her father was someone connected to the underworld. Someone who had never acknowledged her existence. Someone who owed her the truth. For months, Clara researched. She dug through old news articles, police reports, and rumors whispered in the dark corners of Brooklyn. She learned about the DeLuca family, their operations, their influence. She learned about Don Enrico DeLuca, the head of the organization. And she learned where they met. Tonight, she had come to that place. She had walked through the rain, her heart pounding, the gun heavy in her hands. She didn't know if she had the courage to pull the trigger. She didn't even know if she wanted to. All she knew was that she needed answers. She needed to look into the eyes of the man who had abandoned her and demand the truth. Now, standing in that warehouse, Clara pointed the gun directly at Don Enrico. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. She told him what her mother had said. She described the ring. She told him that she knew who he was. The room remained silent. The other men watched, unsure whether to intervene. But Don Enrico slowly rose from his seat. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call for his men to remove her. Instead, he did something unexpected. He removed the gold ring from his finger and placed it gently on the table. His eyes met Clara's, and in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The resemblance was there, in the shape of her face, in the fire in her eyes, in the defiance that mirrored his own. Don Enrico spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of regret. He told her that she had come looking for blood, but all he had left to give was the truth. Clara's hands trembled harder. The gun felt impossibly heavy. Tears began to stream down her face as the realization settled over her like a cold blanket. The man she had come to confront, the man she had hated without ever knowing, was her father. The gun slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Don Enrico stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair and draped it over Clara's shoulders. The gesture was quiet, almost fatherly, and it broke something inside her. She didn't pull away, she didn't run. She simply stood there, her body shaking, her mind struggling to process the flood of emotions crashing over her. The other men at the table remained frozen. Some of them had known Don Enrico for decades, but they had never seen him like this. They had seen him make ruthless decisions, order unspeakable acts, and face down enemies without flinching. But they had never seen him vulnerable. Don Enrico told her to sit. Clara hesitated, but eventually lowered herself into a chair. He sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. And then, for the first time in 23 years, he spoke about Maria Rossi. He told Clara that he had met her mother when he was younger, before the weight of the family had fully settled on his shoulders. Maria had been working at a cafe in Little Italy, and she had been unlike anyone he had ever known. She was kind, genuine, and untouched by the darkness of his world. For a brief time, he had believed he could be someone different with her, someone better. But the life he led didn't allow for that kind of hope. When Maria told him she was pregnant, Don Enrico had been faced with an impossible choice. Bringing her and the child into his world would have made them targets. Enemies would have used them to get to him. Rivals would have seen them as leverage. He had convinced himself that the only way to protect them was to stay away. He had given Maria money, enough to ensure she and the child would never want for anything, but Maria had refused it. She told him she didn't want his blood money, and she didn't want him in their lives. She wanted to give their daughter a chance at something better, something clean. And so, Don Enrico had honored that wish. He had stayed away. He had never reached out. He had carried the weight of that decision every single day. Clara listened, her tears falling silently. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to scream at him for abandoning her, for leaving her mother to struggle alone, for robbing her of a father. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. She saw regret. She saw pain. She saw a man who had spent decades living with the consequences of his choices. Don Enrico told her that she didn't belong in this world. He said that the men who sat at this table had lost pieces of themselves to survive in it. He said that the weight of the family, the legacy, the power, it came at a cost, and he didn't want that cost to be paid by her. But then he said something that changed everything. He told her that even though she didn't belong in this world, it still belonged to her. She was his blood. She was a DeLuca. And whether she wanted it or not, that meant something. Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to reconcile the man sitting before her with the image she had built in her mind. She didn't know if she could forgive him. But for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of a truth she had always been denied. She had a father, and he was sitting right in front of her. The rain outside had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Clara finally stood to leave. Don Enrico didn't try to stop her. He simply watched as she walked toward the door, his coat still draped over her shoulders. The other men at the table remained silent, understanding that something profound had just occurred, something that would shift the balance of everything they knew. But before Clara reached the door, she stopped. She turned back, her eyes meeting her father's one last time. She asked him a question that hung in the air like a challenge. She asked if he regretted it, all of it. The life he had lived, the choices he had made, the people he had hurt. Don Enrico was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of decades, he answered. He told her that regret was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. He said that every choice he had made, every decision, had been to protect the family. But if there was one thing he truly regretted, it was not fighting harder to be in her life. Clara nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked out into the night. But her story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself standing at a crossroads. She had the truth now. She knew who her father was. She knew the world he came from, and she knew that she had a choice to make. She could walk away. She could leave the past behind, honor her mother's memory, and build a life far from the shadows of the DeLuca family. Or she could step into that world, claim the legacy that was rightfully hers, and discover what it truly meant to carry the name DeLuca. Clara spent many sleepless nights wrestling with that decision. She thought about her mother, about the sacrifices Maria had made to keep her away from this life. She thought about the man she had pointed a gun at, the man who was her father. She thought about the weight of legacy, the cost of power, and the price of belonging. And then, one evening, Clara returned to the warehouse. This time, she didn't bring a gun. She didn't come in anger or desperation. She came because she had made a choice. When she walked through that door, Don Enrico looked up from the table, surprise flickering across his face. The other men watched, uncertain of what would happen next. Clara stood before her father and spoke clearly. She told him that she didn't want his world. She didn't want the violence, the power, or the legacy that came with blood and betrayal. But she also told him that she wouldn't run from the truth anymore. She would carry the name Rossi, the name her mother had given her, but she would also acknowledge that she was a DeLuca. And then she said something that no one expected. She told Don Enrico that if he truly regretted not being in her life, then he had a chance now. Not as the head of a criminal empire, but as a father. She said she didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but she was willing to try if he was. For the first time in decades, Don Enrico DeLuca felt something break inside him. Not the hardened shell he had built to survive, but something deeper, something human. He stood, and without a word, he embraced his daughter. The men at the table looked away, giving them the privacy of a moment that transcended the darkness of the world they lived in. Clara's journey didn't end with easy answers. She and her father would spend years navigating the complicated relationship between them. There would be arguments, misunderstandings, and moments where the weight of the past threatened to pull them apart. But there would also be moments of connection, of understanding, and of healing. Clara never entered the criminal world. She built her own life, pursued her own dreams, and honored her mother's memory by staying true to the values Maria had instilled in her. But she also stayed connected to her father, visiting him when she could, sharing conversations over coffee, and slowly building something that resembled a relationship. Don Enrico, for his part, began to change. He remained the head of the family, but he made different choices. He used his influence to protect Clara from the dangers of his world, and he began to think about legacy in a different way. Not as power or territory, but as the people you leave behind and the impact you have on their lives. Years later, when Don Enrico passed away, Clara stood at his funeral, surrounded by men who had once been strangers to her. They looked at her with respect, not because of fear or obligation, but because they had seen something rare. They had seen a man capable of change, and they had seen the daughter who had made it possible. Clara placed a single rose on her father's casket and whispered a quiet goodbye. She didn't know if he had found redemption, but she knew that in the end he had tried. And for her, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story of truth, legacy, and the complicated bonds between fathers and daughters, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful and emotional narratives. Each story we share explores the depths of the human experience. The choices we make, the secrets we carry, and the redemption we seek. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now and join us on this journey. 5 years had passed since that rainy night in the Newark warehouse. 5 years since Clara Rossi had walked through that door with a gun in her trembling hands and a question that would change her life forever. The world had continued turning. Seasons had changed, and life had moved forward in the way it always does. Relentless, indifferent, and full of unexpected turns. Clara stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment in Manhattan, adjusting the collar of her blazer. She had just turned 28, and her life looked nothing like she had imagined it would when she was younger. She worked as a social worker now, helping at-risk youth in the Bronx, kids who reminded her of herself in so many ways. Kids who grew up without fathers, who asked questions that had no easy answers, who carried the weight of absence like a stone in their chest. Her apartment was modest, but comfortable. The walls were decorated with photographs. Her mother's picture held a place of honor on the mantel, forever frozen in a moment of happiness that Clara cherished. But there was another photograph now, one that would have seemed impossible years ago. It was a picture of Clara and Don Enrico taken at a small cafe in Little Italy about 2 years before his death. In the photo, he was smiling, a rare, genuine smile, and Clara stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. The relationship between father and daughter had never been simple. There were times when Clara had wanted to walk away completely, when the weight of his past and the darkness of his world had felt too heavy to bear. There were arguments, silences that lasted weeks, and moments when she questioned whether redemption was even possible for a man like him. But there were also moments of unexpected tenderness, moments when he would call her just to hear her voice, moments when he would ask about her work, genuinely interested in the lives she was trying to save. Moments when she saw glimpses of the man he might have been if life had taken him down a different path. Don Enrico had kept his promise. He had never tried to pull Clara into his world. He had protected her from the dangers that came with his name, and he had used his considerable influence to ensure that no one in his organization would ever threaten her. But more than that, he had tried to be a father, not the father she had needed when she was a child. That opportunity had been lost forever, but the father he could be in the time they had left. When he died, it had been peaceful. A heart attack in his sleep, the doctors said. He was 73 years old, and his body had finally given out after decades of stress, violence, and the weight of command. Clara had been there in his final days, sitting beside his hospital bed, holding his weathered hand. In those last conversations, he had told her things he had never shared with anyone else. He told her about the first man he had killed, and how it had changed him. He told her about the friends he had lost, the betrayals he had survived, and the loneliness that came with power. And he told her that meeting her again had been the only truly good thing he had done in the last 20 years of his life. Clara had cried when he died, not just for the father she had known for such a short time, but for all the years they had lost, for the life her mother had lived, working herself to exhaustion to give Clara a chance at something better, for the complexity of loving someone whose hands were stained with so much darkness. The funeral had been a surreal experience. The church had been filled with men in expensive suits, their faces hard and unreadable. These were the soldiers, the captains, the enforcers of the DeLuca family. They had looked at Clara with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some of them had known about her existence. Others were learning about Don Enrico's daughter for the first time. But all of them understood what her presence meant. She was the old man's blood. She was family. After the funeral, Clara had been approached by Vincent DeLuca, her father's younger brother, and the man who would now lead the family. Vincent was different from his brother, colder, more calculating, less burdened by sentiment. He had told Clara bluntly that she had a choice to make. She could take her place within the family structure, claim her inheritance, and become part of the legacy, or she could walk away completely, and the family would ensure she was left alone, protected but separate. Clara had chosen the latter. She told Vincent that she appreciated the offer, but the life her father had lived was not the life she wanted. She would honor his memory in her own way, but she would not become part of the criminal empire he had built. Vincent had nodded, unsurprised by her answer. He told her that her father had predicted she would say exactly that, and that he had respected her for it. But Vincent had also given her something. He handed her a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter her father had written years ago, shortly after their first reunion in the warehouse. The letter was long, written in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. In it, he apologized for every year he had missed. He told her about her mother, about how Maria had been the only woman he had ever truly loved, and how leaving her had been the hardest decision of his life. He wrote about the sleepless nights, the guilt, and the desperate hope that someday he might have a chance to make things right. At the end of the letter, he had written something that Clara would carry with her forever. He wrote that she had given him something he thought he had lost long ago. Hope. Hope that redemption was possible. Hope that even in the darkest life there could be moments of light. Hope that love, even complicated and imperfect, could still matter. Now, 5 years later, Clara carried that letter with her everywhere. It was folded carefully in her wallet, a reminder of where she had come from and the choices she had made. Her work with at-risk youth had become her calling. She saw so many kids like herself, angry, lost, searching for answers that adults refused to give them. She helped them navigate the system, find resources, and most importantly, she listened. She gave them something she had desperately needed when she was younger, someone who understood that not every question had a simple answer, and that sometimes the truth was messy and complicated. Some of her colleagues knew about her father. The story had made the news when Don Enrico died, and Clara's name had been mentioned, but she never hid from it. She acknowledged her past, but she didn't let it define her. She was Clara Rossi, daughter of Maria Rossi, a woman who had worked herself to death to give her child a better life. And she was also Clara Rossi, daughter of Enrico DeLuca, a man who had lived in darkness but had tried in the end to find some measure of light. Tonight, Clara was heading to a community center in the Bronx, where she volunteered twice a week. She grabbed her bag, took one last look at the photograph of her parents, the one of her mother she had always treasured, and the one of her father she had learned to accept, and headed out into the New York evening. The city was alive with lights and noise, indifferent to the stories of the people who walked its streets. But Clara knew that everyone carried their own weight, their own secrets, their own questions without easy answers. And as she walked through the crowded sidewalks toward the community center, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the peace that comes from having all the answers, but the peace that comes from accepting that some questions will never be fully resolved. The peace that comes from choosing to move forward anyway, carrying the weight of your past, but not being crushed by it. Clara Rossi had pointed a gun at a room full of mafiosos and demanded to know who her father was. And in finding that answer, she had discovered something far more important. She had discovered who she was and who she wanted to be, and that, more than any legacy or inheritance, was worth everything. Thank you for joining us on Clara's journey. Her story reminds us that our past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. That forgiveness is complicated, family is messy, and redemption is always possible. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that explore the depths of human experience. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next chapter.